Hello friends, welcome to another tutorial. This time we will learn something ScandiPWA specific. We will take a look on component structure, what are the best approaches for developing. So let's get straight into it. Let's open our VSCode. As you can see, it's again empty and I have already ran my yarn start command. So now here, just like in the previous tutorial, we will create an index.js, and here I will import the React DOM from React DOM, and I will call the render on it, and I will provide a new component which we will be using. It is the URL resolver. We will speak about what will it be a little bit later, and we will also provide a node where it should render the result. It's the element by ID root. You can see the URL resolver is not yet created and available, so we should do it. Let's press Command-Shift-P or Control-Shift-P and open up Action Palette. Here we can type in create new component, and if you have installed your extension properly, it should prompt you for a component name. We will enter the URL resolver inside, and it will ask me if I would like to have business logic in my container, and I will press yes. I will not, however, check the global state just yet. So I press enter and my component gets generated. You can see I have some issues with imports, which we can easily fix by pressing this button. So I will fix this problem as well, and I will comment out unused imports. We will need it later, so I will comment them for now. And we're left with the import. Let's import it, and let's do import from index.js. And this is the wrong import, so let's use the alias. And now let's fix the order. So this is how the import looks like. As you can see, we're using component here, which means that it takes the route to component. You don't need to specify a relative URL, you can use the alias to an absolute path to this folder. So the component stands for component. There are other folders available for you for similar aliases. So as you can see, the ScandiPWA internally also has a query folder, route folder, store, style, type, and utility. And you can reference them by using the similar aliases, writing them with a capital letter. Now, going into our URL resolver, let's output something here so we can see that the component has been properly rendered. So I'll say hello, and let's switch to the Chrome and see the hello being outputted. And that's all right. Now let's talk a little bit what will our URL resolver component do. The main task of URL resolver is to determine the page type, and number two, render the proper page. So from our goals, we will need to take URL using location API, and we will need to detect to which entity type does this URL refer to. Is it a page? Is it a category? Is it a product? So we will need some mechanism to determine this, and we will need some place to do it. Let's solve this task sequentially. Let's start with a rendering. Let's assume there are multiple page types. What are the options to implement this? Well, we can go here. Let's assume the type will be coming from props to us because, well, we could determine it in the component, but the components are made for pure rendering, for presentation. And the URL determination doesn't really look like a front-end task. So we will do it in our container, which we will tackle a little bit later. Let's assume the container ships us a type as a prop. And you can remember what's prop from the previous lesson. We will take the type from props, and as again, we will need to declare it. Here, I will uncomment my prop types, and I will define that type as a string, and it will be required. So I'm requiring a prop type of type string. Great. Now, how would we approach rendering? Well, the first thing we can do is we can say if the type is equal to product, then we can return product. Else, if the type is equal to category, then return a category. If nothing of those two is found, then we will return a CMS page, let's say. Of course, the compiler is arguing, it's failing to compile, because it says that else here is redundant. Well, we can easily remove it. Now our logic looks like this. If it's a type product, we return a product. Let's a little bit complicated with, first of all, creating a render methods for each of those types. For product rendering, we will use render product. For category, render category. And here let's return old strings we had here. That will be a product, that will be category. And let's also improve our code a little bit by moving this into constants, by moving types into constants. Let's do const product type, and it will be equal to product. Let's do the same for category, CMS page. But now you can see it's arguing on us. It says, please add exports. Now the different issue appears. Compiler wants us to create a config file for constants. Why is so? Well, that's because how Webpack works. In order to minimize the bundle size, we should move the reusable by other modules constants outside from large modules, because it's not obligatory the module itself will be used. It could be that only a constant of it will be needed. But Webpack is unable to split modules apart. It can only resolve on module level. You should move the constants into a separate module, and creating file means creating a new module. We moved our constants, now we need to import them. Set a product type, category type, and for this one, we'll need a render. Let's do render CMS page, return CMS page here. And this is this render CMS page. The issue with this code is that it does repeat itself. You can see it repeating the if check, and it could be written better. So what are the better options? Well, the option you could suggest is to write a switch statement. So let's switch the type. And notice the ScandiPWA has a very interesting notation for writing switch cases. The switch and the case are located on the same line. So now we can do it like so. And in the case of category, return the category. Page type case can return this render CMS page. Let's add a fallback. So in case we haven't resolved the URL into something known, let's show the 404 page. By default, if none of our previous conditions were met, let's return render 404. So let's also add this method here. It should return 404. Now we can remove this part. The imports are required to be fixed by compiler, so let's quickly fix them. Now let's get back to our browser and see what's going on. Well, it says 404. Of course, the type isn't yet passed, it's undefined, so it's falling back into this default case. But this is also not the best solution. Why? Well, because this is not extensible. We cannot simply push something into this list of types and quickly implement the approach. We would need to rewrite the whole method for it. The solution is to create a map, a rendering map. So let's define a render map here, render map, and this render map will be an object. And as a key, it will take a type, category type, mapped to a render of the category. Doing this, as you remember from one of the tutorials, can cause the context loss. So we are binding category type to render category function. The same we will do for product and the CMS page type. Great, we created a render map. Now we should just take our switch case and rewrite it to use maps. To do it, we say that const render function is equal to this.render map, and then we take type and try to search it inside of our object. And if we find one, then we should return it. So if render function, then we should return the call of this render function. Otherwise, we should call the 404 page. This looks simple enough. There is a small optimization we can do here. We can add it like so. Instead of writing this if, we can give it a fallback case like so. Render 404 in case you didn't found any function by this type. Use the default one. So this is kind of the fallback syntax. And now we can simply call the render function always. So it becomes a really simple code to execute. So let's see how it works. It should still output us the 404. So this is the approach with render maps. You can see that we created a map, and now to extend it, we can just simply add a new key to this object. If we want to add a new type into this render map, we can extend the URL resolver, and in the constructor, we can assign our type to a function. Very neat. We created a rendering logic. So this one is done. What about the determining page type? Well, as I said, that's a work for a container. The container should contain the business logic, while the component just presentation. To determine the URL, we should go into the URL container. We can try to guess the URL type based on the URL. We can also request the URL from Magento URL resolver, also known as URL rewrite resolver. We will do it in the next tutorial, but for now, let's try to guess which type are you referring to based on the location. So in order to do it, we should first understand the concept of container. It has two functions always defined, the container function and the container props. The container functions is an object containing the mapping of a key, which will be passed later on to your component as a prop, and the function which will implement this prop. This is the getData key, which will be passed as a prop to a component where it will call it, and it will return some data, but the logic itself will be located in the container, so the component will simply call it. In our case, we seem to not need it. We only need to determine the page type. We don't really need to pass some function inside of the component. There will be no handlers available to a user. So no handlers needed, then we can get rid of the container function. So let's remove it from here and here. So the next step is to understand what is the container props. The container props are meant for props mapping. You have a property to define, like is disabled or a type, and then you provide a function getter which gets this property. But again, the property itself is used in the component for rendering, but the value is retrieved in the container. This exactly matches what we need here. We need to determine the page type. We need to define a prop. So let's say we need to define a prop type, and we will provide a function for it. Let's say get type from URL. Let's now create this function. The only thing we're missing here is to add those brackets, so it's a valid object returned instead of a function. Now this should return something. Let's, for a test, say that we will return the product type. And let's also import this, and the product should be displayed here. Now we need to implement the mapping itself. Well, let's assume the page we are visiting will contain the type in the URL. Let's say it could have the product in the URL or category, the page. So let's define mapping again, because we know it's a great approach for rendering. Why wouldn't it be for determining the type? But this time, instead of mapping to a function, let's map it to regex, because the regex is the fastest way to determine something in a string. So let's say this will be a type map, and this time we will map the same values like here, the category type, to the regexes, and we need to import missing functions, and let's write those simple regexes. So how to determine the product is product? Well, to test for the product, and the same will go for the category, and the same CMS page. So now we have a mapping of URL type to a regex determining this type. Let's loop through the types, and to do it we will use the object.entries, this type map, and loop through it. So let's use a for each. We will take the regex and we will try if the regex.test window.location.pathname. So we're testing if the path name currently provided matches, and I'm doing this properly because it's an object entries. The first key is type, or the key of an object, and the second one is a regex. So this time this will be a type and this will be the regex. To return the type, it will return from the whole function. Otherwise we should return 404, or we can return nothing, will be handled as 404 by component. Great, but we see an issue. It says unallowed use of flat, but we couldn't really use const here because we are assigning this. Let's disable this check. It pretty much works. We have the 404 if we have specified nothing, and we will get product if we specify product and whatever after it. Very good. This construction looks a little bit complex. Well, how can we solve it? Yes, the one of optimizations we can do is to define an array beforehand and to pass this inside, so we don't need to repeat it multiple times. Indeed, it looks much simpler, but this is not yet perfect. Why? Because type mapping here is not really what we need. As we can see, we're looping through the array to find some proper value. So in this case, using a map is not the right way to go. We should declare a list instead, where we will provide a list with a type regex and the type to map this regex for. Let's define a type list, and inside of it, this will be an array, and inside of it, let's provide an object which will contain a type. This will be a category and the regex. Again, this structure is much easier to work with in our case because we can simply loop through it. So let's apply the same values to it, and now we can get rid of our type map. And now let's try to implement the same logic, but now using our type list, and see how easier will it be. So now we can use the same for loop we had here, but pass this type list instead. So we're looping through our type list, and we will take the type and regex from it. The other logic will stay pretty much the same. Well, let's try if it works. It indeed works. Can we optimize it even further? Well, yes, there is a way to optimize it a little bit. We can use the functions which are provided on array for us. So if we go typelist.find, we can find something inside of our type list. So inside we will get an arguments of type and regex, where destructuring each element of type list into type and regex, and we are checking for this specific value. And if we find some entry, we should get the type from it and return the found type. Great. The issue with this solution is that find could return null, and in case find returns us null, we will be unable to destructure it, and we will get an issue. Cannot destructure property type because it's undefined. It's correct. So how to deal with it? Let's first format this a little bit, and the solution in this case would be to add a default value for our destructuring. So in case we cannot find anything, we will use the empty array. And if we destructure an empty array, the type will be undefined. And undefined will be handled by component. Let's see if it works now. Yes, the 404 is shown, no error. And the product works as well. You can see how smaller the logic became after we moved to a type list. This is why understanding what data structure you need before attempting implementation is really important. Before you start doing something, sit for a second and try to understand what specifically you need in your case. For finding some value, the array is handy. For rendering something, knowing the key, the map is better. The only thing we forgot to do is to implement styles. How should we approach it? First of all, let's move our type rendering into separate function. So let's say render type, and let's move everything from here to there. Why? Well, that's because in our render, we would like to render the wrapper. We will use the main element because it properly describes what's going on here. Let's say the block of this element will be equal to URL resolver. Inside of it, let's simply call this .render type. We would also like to provide some abstraction for each type rendering. Let's wrap this render function with an article. So here we can say that it also is related to a block of type URL resolver, and it has an element. This element is called the type. But this wouldn't be enough to style and to differ the 404 page from the product page. So let's add a mods here, and let's provide an object which will contain a type. But if we check how this works now, the type here will be undefined. In order to mitigate this issue, we will set a default value here. And now if we'll check, class name will include 404 here. We could have done this for each of those methods as well and simply hard-coded the value, but this wouldn't be as simple to do, and we would need to write much more code. Keep it simple and do not repeat yourself. Those are important principles, and you should, of course, follow them. Now we have the structure to style. We have URL resolver and URL resolver type. Let's get inside and apply some styles. Let's set styles for the type element of URL resolver block, and let's set a font size for the whole block. So let's say I want them to be 20 pixels in size. Looks much better. Let's say that the color by default will be orange. But if we remember correctly, we should declare our style variables up here. URL resolver color is equal to orange. So now we can use this variable instead. Let's see how it changes, and indeed we can see the orange numbers. And we can check the product, and it will also be orange. Now let's implement the type specific colors. Let's say the type here and the type here will be 404. So let's say for 404 we want specifically red color. So let's check if we can. Yes, the red color is shown. But what's the issue here? We are redefining a property. This is not the great solution. Instead, we can simply redefine the CSS custom variable. And indeed, it still works. But what if we would move this variable declaration above into the URL resolver? Well, you can see that our logic will stop working. We will be unable to set the color here. Why is it so? Well, that's because, as I said in the previous tutorial, the CSS custom variable is resolved from above. The first element it will look at is the HTML, and you can see the my variable is defined there. Going downwards on the body and later on the root and later on the main element, we can see no other redeclarations of this variable, though it will persist. It will not care if the variable declaration will appear inside of the element. It only cares if it appears above the element. And this is why color property declarations should appear on the same level or deeper than the variable red declaration. Only thing left to do is to get rid of this red declaration here, because it will be tedious to find it in the code later on. So add URL resolver 404 color, and let's switch it to red, and then let's use this variable and simply redeclare variable with variable, so later if we need it we can always change this to blue and our 404 color will become blue. This will be very useful when implementing customization from admin panel or from the user land. Now you are familiar with the most practices used in ScandiPWA. In the next tutorial, we will learn how to make real requests to GraphQL. So see you in the next tutorial. Bye!